Typically, women strive to maintain the warmth and coziness of the family unit, nurturing their partners, particularly when there are little ones involved. So, why did my wife turn her back on our love with such apparent ease? In April, my wife and I finally transitioned from our parents' homes into our very own apartment. There were countless decisions to be made about renovations. While I was out earning a living, my wife dedicated her entire days to caring for our energetic 2-year-old twins. Just a couple of weeks after settling in, we attended a meeting for the residents, and after a while, I couldn't help but wonder, who would you even recall an hour later? Avery became acquainted with the woman residing on the first floor. Grace resided with her daughter, who was busy with work, along with her son. One day, she was out strolling with her grandson by the sandbox, and our little ones struck up a friendship with them, leading to regular visits back and forth. The kids would come to our place, and our energetic ones would head over to theirs. There was even a time when our neighbor entrusted us with our little Jackson, while she dashed off to attend to some pressing matters. She even proposed that, should the need arise, we could leave our twins with her, a suggestion my wife eagerly took to heart. Whenever she needed to make a run to the supermarket for supplies, she would drop the twins off with Grace on the ground floor, only to return with a treat, a kinder surprise, for her grandson. Yet, I still can't figure out whether this old lady was aware of my wife's peculiar little arrangement. Who else comes to mind? That guy from our building. He lived a floor above us, in a place where the residents are doing pretty well, given that these apartments don't come cheap, and the neighborhood is all shiny and new. Yet, even amidst all the success, this guy stood out. He had a knack for unwinding like nobody's business. Nearly every evening, he'd hop into a cab and go paint the town red. My wife and I talked about him once, but little did I know just how much trouble he'd end up causing me. Hey, he's got a fancy car and a slick motorcycle. So why does he always take a taxi? Avery asked me one day. Probably doesn't want to chance it. Driving after a few drinks, I replied. And he always looked snazzy, like he was getting his clothes custom made. You know, Avery mused, he lives alone and sometimes rolls in on his bike right in the dead of night. When the kids are up, I can hear him coming in. Weird, but I've never noticed, I said, shaking my head. I must admit, I often find myself green with envy, living vicariously through someone who seems to lead such a fascinating existence, filled with sorrows night after night, living purely for their own joy, never skimping on their desires. Meanwhile, our own plans to seaside escapades remain just dreams, bogged down by our restless kids and every dime funneling into endless repairs ahead of negotiations. It's this perpetual penny pinching that weighs heavily. What's more, the sight of that peeling wallpaper in the corridor and the antiquated gadgets cluttering the kitchen only adds salt to the wound. I appreciate your understanding of the situation. It was equally disheartening for me to come back to an apartment where the renovations were still up in the air, yet I was adamant about not settling for inferior quality materials. Today will go down as one to be etched in my memory forever. I got home from work to find that both my kids and wife were conspicuously absent, almost as if they'd embarked on one of their marathon shopping expeditions. It brought back vivid memories of the cacophony our toddlers create when they both decide they fancy the same sweet in the supermarket aisle. I hung around for a while before I began reaching out to my wife. "Avery, where are you?" "I've been here waiting," I inquired. "I'm just picking up a few things from the store." "I'll join you shortly, love." "Oh, and could you pick up a replacement shaving machine head?" "I chucked the old one out earlier today and totally spaced on stopping by the shop," I added. Her response was ambiguous, neither confirming nor denying. She just promised to come back in 10 minutes before hanging up. I had enough time to boil water, arrange the dishes, and dig into my smartphone. As promised, shortly after that, the door burst open, and my cheerful friends burst into the apartment. I took the grocery bag from them right from the doorway and went in search of shaving supplies, but returned empty-handed. "Where are they?" I begged. "Oh, it slipped my mind," she admitted, clearly sensing my concern. I unpacked the bread and some jars of jam and threw away the rest of the food. An empty grocery bag ended up on the windowsill, where I immersed myself in contemplation of the drizzling landscape outside the window. It was raining fine, but incessantly, the same one that accompanied me on my way home from work, slightly annoying, but tolerable. Running through the yard, I found that the parcel that I took from my spouse remained untouched by moisture. There were no traces of dirt on the children's shoes inside, and the clothes were suspiciously dry. There was a neatly folded umbrella by the door. It was obvious that even an attempt by all three of them to huddle under it would not save them from the dampness. I still didn't realize all the consequences of this predicament, but I was already getting restless. Unfortunately or not, our guys have not been able to provide any clarity at the moment. "Where did you run off to?" I wondered. Grabbing her hand, I led her to the window. "Among these raindrops," I pointed to the glass. Her face turned pale, and she started gasping for air. It even occurred to me to worry about the state of my own heart. She was silent for a while longer. Then it dawned on her that she couldn't come up with a plausible excuse. Indeed, her hands were trembling. Her lips were trembling slightly, but her confessions, uttered in a whisper, were distinguishable. It turned out that she often visited our neighbour, who had a motorcycle, and more than once. A couple of times a week, she stopped by his house under the guise of going to work, and stayed there for at least half an hour. For a month now, as she left the children with Mrs. Grace, she told us that she went to the store, when in fact she ran with them on business in the early morning, and then left the groceries in a bag at the entrance to our building. I was unsure of how to act, particularly with the kids scampering about, lugging their playthings and whatnot. I thought this was a one-time thing. Then I figured it would be short, and after that, I'm clueless. Avery was perched on a stool, repeatedly smoothing her hair, tucking it neatly behind her ears. She wasn't weeping, but her lips quivered, even vibrated slightly. Eventually, I couldn't bear to look at her, got dressed, and stepped outside. Having nothing to lose, I approached my neighbour's door. A man greeted me upon opening. "I'm her husband," I blurted out, scrambling for what to say next. "Right, I gather you're trying to dodge any arguments or brawls," he noted, clearly caught off guard, yet he beckoned me inside. "What are you after?" he inquired. "What do you mean? What am I after? You've encountered my wife." "Sure, but why should that bother you? You're parting ways." "What? Why would you think that?" "Oh, she mentioned that she was on the hunt for a rental while she's got to stick around here. Look, we're not splitting up, or at least we weren't planning on it. But now, obviously, we will. We've got 2 kids, for crying out loud." "Hold up, we didn't even mention kids. Didn't you notice she was strolling around with them? Honestly, I head out early and roll back in late. It's not my concern who's going where or with whom. She popped by, and then she was gone. Simple as that." "And how'd you manage to coax her over to your place?" "What do you mean when you say lured?" "A team from the agency came to see me. They installed stretch ceilings for me. They even plastered their van with advertisements. The job is done in full. When I finished, I went outside, said goodbye to everyone and expressed my gratitude. Just at that moment, A charming young lady came up to us and asked about the appearance of the ceiling. She asked if it was necessary to lower the curtain rods or, perhaps, trim the curtains. Her questions were quite appropriate. I, not being a recluse, invited her in so that she could see for herself. She conducted a tour, observing the work done. Playing the friendly host, I offered her a glass of wine, which she accepted without hesitation. After drinking a couple of glasses, she began to praise my lifestyle, impressed by the interesting life and wonderful job I had chosen for myself. At that moment I hugged her, and she didn't resist. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked about her availability. She mentioned that she was going through a divorce. I'm not married, and she seemed free to, at least, that's what it seemed to me. If I had known that she was still someone's wife and mother, I would have stayed away, as I maintain an impeccable social circle, avoiding complications. I'm sorry, buddy. And yes, she dropped in on me from time to time for short, casual dates. I didn't know about her obligations. And what kind of situation do you have with her? What do you mean by what? I mean, do you plan to continue what you started? The guy said, "What kind of connection is this?" She wanted to be sharp and fast. I felt the same way too. But what does the term relationships have to do with this mess? I'm not going to change anything in my life. I'm quite happy with what I have. Of course, I don't want to take on an additional burden. And frankly, even have children. It's not my type. I slowly left the house and eventually went down to my apartment. Avery had already set the table for the children's dinner there. I was looking at the babies. How could you destroy everything we had in common so easily? How can I move on and see my boys only from time to time? What nonsense. I couldn't hold back anymore. I dreamed of a life filled with beauty and warmth. What is she really worth compared to the family joys she missed? I packed my things and left. Now I can only think about what to do with the apartment.